Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming this morning. You're very welcome to the launch of ITIC's Tourism Industry Revival Plan, which sets out tourism's rescue in the immediate term and recovery in the short term and recovery in the medium term. So today, as you know, is the first day of Phase 3, which of course is when the tourism industry can reopen after nearly 4 months of being closed. I don't need to tell anyone in the room how devastating this COVID-19 period has been for the Irish tourism and hospitality sector, which is the country's largest indigenous industry and biggest regional employer. We're very aware that COVID-19 is a public health issue, first and foremost, but it has had shattering economic consequences, and the Irish tourism industry has been in the business front line. Tens of thousands of jobs and hundreds of businesses are at risk unless the correct measures are taken now. I'll let Owen take you through the highlights of the revival plan, which is a major piece of work developed in consultation with the leading organisations and stakeholders in Irish tourism and hospitality. It includes the urgent measures needed for the sector's survival, and it also outlines 45 policy recommendations that we urge the new government to accept. And that'll have to be 44 after the announcement of the new minister, but I'm sure you'll come on to that later. The plan outlines 3 growth scenarios: an optimistic one, a baseline one, and a pessimistic one for Irish tourism between now and 2025. We believe that Ireland's tourism industry can deliver the optimistic outcome if COVID-19 is contained and government adopts the recommendations within the revival plan. This would mean by 2025, €2 billion in annual net tax receipts to the Exchequer and 323,000 people employed in the sector. Of course, as we all know, we now have a new government and a new minister. So we wish Catherine Martin well in her new role and look forward to working with her. However, we must state that, as an industry, we are very disappointed and indeed very frustrated that tourism has not been placed in an economic or business department, which we've been calling for a number of years now. Tourism is the economic lifeblood of regional Ireland and needs to be thought of as an engine of growth, Exchequer returns and employment. The survival plan sets out how tourism can rise from this existential crisis, and I now hand over to Owen to bring us through some of the highlights and recommendations. Due to health reasons, we're not handing out press releases or copies of the revival plan, but these will be emailed to you shortly. So Owen, over to you, and we'll take questions after Owen speaks.
Thanks, Maurice, and thanks, Catherine. And we put this together over the last, I suppose, month, 6 weeks. As all of you, I think, know, the Irish Tourism Industry Confederation is the umbrella group representing the inbound tourism and hospitality sector here in Ireland. So airlines, hotels, attractions, restaurants, vintners and so on are all part of our grouping. And we've spent a kind of a very intensive 6-week period putting this together and bringing together the view, the sort of measured, calibrated view of the tourism and hospitality sector about the crisis that we're facing. And as Mara said, it's an existential crisis. Literally, businesses are up against the wall and thousands of jobs are at stake. But I mean, we can all moan and gripe about how bad things are, and there's lots of sectors which are feeling the pain. What we wanted to do was to be constructive and to come up with a kind of a solution-oriented policy about how we could come out the other side of this, because fingers crossed, you know, the public health crisis that we're in at the moment will pass with time. There will be a vaccination or there will be treatment, and the key thing is that we have a tourism and hospitality industry still in existence and still in place so that we can prosper once again. Because remember, and those of you that kind of talked to me before know that I'm like a broken record on this, it's Ireland's largest indigenous industry and it's the biggest regional employer the country has by some distance. It's twice as big in terms of jobs as something like farming and agriculture. And if you go to parts of regional Ireland, it's the only show in town. So it's that important. And there was disappointment. Maris mentioned you know, our call for tourism to be treated as an economic ministry, an economic portfolio. So there was significant disappointment across the whole tourism and hospitality sector on Saturday when tourism was put in with non-economic portfolios. We wish Catherine Martin very, very well, and we'll work very closely with her. But to our mind, tourism is misaligned, and tourism should be in there along with enterprise and jobs and with economic development. And that's an argument that we'll continue to say, and we'll continue to say because tourism is the biggest indigenous industry the country has and needs to be treated as such. So in very kind of brief format, because nobody wants to see death by PowerPoint, I'm going to take you through some of the highlights of the revival plan. It's very much a collective approach, so the hoteliers, the attractions, the restaurants, the two state agencies, Forestry Ireland and Tourism Ireland, they've all inputted to this, and we think it's sort of a solution-oriented approach to how tourism and hospitality can recover from this enormous crisis. We've been hit quickest and hardest. I think everyone nearly accepts that. But for example, you have international travel is effectively prohibited into Ireland at the moment, and 75% of the tourism economy is dependent on international tourism. This is a significant day because it's the first day that the tourism and hospitality sector has been allowed reopen. So we've had effectively 4 months of closure. But we're only allowed reopen obviously at partial capacity because social distancing rules are at place. So if you go into a restaurant or this hotel or whatever, you'll see it is far, far quieter than it should be on June 29th because of the crisis that we're in, and that directly impacts and impedes the financial viability of businesses. We have effectively no international arrivals because of the 14-day quarantine rule, which to our mind is like a closed sign above the island for international tourism, and that's massively damaging. Remember, 75% of the tourism economy is based on international visitation, and other countries are actually going in the other direction. They're still maintaining public health guidelines and best practices, but they are allowing international arrivals to prosper again. But this revival plan, it sets out a series of, if you like, solutions and recommendations, because we can all talk forever about how dire things are, and I'm sure you've all heard it. But this is solution oriented, and we've really talked widely to the industry, and we've consulted with external experts about coming up with solutions and recommendations, and that's what I'll talk you through very briefly. It's been emailed to you as we speak, so you'll have it in a digital copy, and we will be printing a hard copy and we'll send it out to you in due course, but obviously with all the rules and regulations at the moment, we can't necessarily hand things out today. This is just to give you an idea. Stand here so I can see the screen. Just to give you an idea of where tourism was in 2019 and the projected outcome for 2020. So it gives you an idea of how savagely hit the tourism and hospitality sector has been. So last year, in 2019, the tourism and hospitality sector as a whole, when you take overseas visitors and the domestic tourism economy and visitors from Northern Ireland, was worth over 9 billion euro to the economy, 9.3 billion euro. Our best estimate is that that will fall by 6.9 billion euro, or say 7 billion euro this year, which is obviously a staggering fall. And remember, that is only because we already had January and February in the bag, because the lockdown and the restrictions only kicked in mid-March. It's actually around St. Patrick's Day weekend, which would have been normally the bumper kickstart to the season. So we had January and February in the bag. We hope for a little bit in Q3, Q4, a little bit more international tourism, but it will be very, very little. It will fall, we think, to €1 billion. Fares to Irish carriers will correspondingly fall. The domestic market will respond, but remember, they've only got, if you like, from today through to the rest of the year to actually spend their money and staycation in Ireland. And an awful lot of the domestic market are families. And there's a very short window between now and when the school holidays recommence. And when the school holidays recommence, the domestic market is unfortunately going to go quiet again. And then there'll be a small little bit of business from the Northern Irish market. So last year, 9.3 billion euro, which was effectively a kind of record level. This year it'll fall to 2.4 billion euro. And that's obviously a movable feast, but it's our best estimate at the moment, and it's a huge wallop. We consulted widely with industry as to what were the big sort of needs or the big sort of requirements for their business in order to get through this. And that's just a word counter to reflect, the bigger the word, the more often it was said back to us. And you can see there things like financial grants, things like the waiving of the rates, a relaxing of the social distancing rule, the maintenance or the continuation of the wage subsidy scheme, all those critical financial and liquidity measures were absolutely critical for businesses to get through this crisis and come out the other end. And I should say from the outset, the tourism and hospitality sector is a very buoyant, positive industry. It's staffed and peopled by people all over the country who have very, very positive mindsets. But this is really an existential crisis, and hundreds of businesses and thousands of jobs are literally on the line. And there is an opportunity, I think, with the July stimulus package and with the new government to really treat tourism and hospitality with the economic support package that it needs to allow us to get through 2020, so we're on some sort of a stable footing come 2021, when hopefully some sort of a recovery comes to pass. I'm conscious I'm blathering away here, but I'm happy to just kind of take questions at the end. This is sort of the immediate measures required for the Irish tourism and hospitality sector as we saw it. First of all, we think a €1.5 billion suite of financial supports should be allocated to the tourism and hospitality sector, and we've divided that up by €1 billion in terms of business supports in grants, so not to be repaid back, grants for viable but vulnerable businesses, and 500 million in terms of liquidity to allow businesses that reopened and have the working capital to prosper again. We think the quarantine period needs to be ended. It's a blunt instrument. Other countries are going in the other direction. Ireland seems to have doubled down on the quarantine rule, and to a certain extent we can assuage public health concerns through testing and through tracing and through good hygiene practices, rather than a kind of the blunt instrument of a clothesline above Ireland. We think tourism needs to be treated as a sector in its own right, and there needs to be sector-specific support from the government, and we hope for that in the July stimulus package. There needs to be relaxing of the social distancing rules. There's a bit of confusion out there at the moment. Is it 2 metres, is it 1 metre? We think it should move to 1 metre, as is recommended by the World Health Organization, and that would allow businesses at least an element of viability. I mean, Gillian we were talking earlier about going to restaurants and stuff, and you know, capacity in restaurants is massively compromised by social distancing rules, whereby if there's a little bit of relaxation of it to still best international practices, it makes vulnerable restaurants and vulnerable hotels that bit more viable. We think mass gatherings need to be looked at. There's kind of an arbitrary rule about gatherings of people whereby, you know, weddings, functions and stuff, there are large rooms that can still adhere to social distancing that shouldn't be capped. And obviously the insurance and banking sector is fundamental that they support Irish tourism in this particular crisis. We do have the July stimulus package, which has been talked about a lot, and the new government is going to implement it, I suppose, in only a week or a couple of weeks' time. We think there needs to be a discrete sum of money for the tourism and hospitality sector in there. We don't think it's right that it's just lumped in with sort of business supports. There has to be a specific sum of money allocated to tourism and hospitality, Ireland's largest indigenous industry, to help us get through this crisis, come out the other side, and still have an industry in place, because that's the big concern. If we get to January 1st and please God COVID has sort of waned and there's maybe treatment or it's sort of in check, but if we don't have a tourism industry, if we don't have hotels and attractions and restaurants and vintners and outdoor activities, then what sort of a tourism product do we have? You know, how easy is it? Like, I see Niall in the room from Tourism Ireland, who's selling the message and marketing Ireland overseas, but he equally needs a really viable, good, varied product here on the ground, if you like, to bring that dream into a reality. There's a number of external factors at play. Sorry, I'm trying to read my notes, which are a bit small there. A number of external factors at play. So, you know, there's only so much we can control. And that goes without saying, but for example, a vaccination or a treatment for COVID is fundamentally important if the tourism and hospitality sector here in Ireland is to recover. If there's a second wave, if there's repeated outbreaks, if there's poor public health standards and stuff, then the tourism and hospitality sector is in the front line and will be in real trouble. We have to hope that the consumer still has confidence to travel, and there is a concern that COVID has really jarred the confidence of the consumer internationally to get on a plane, go to a foreign country and enjoy that holiday experience. So there's a huge onus on us as a country and us as an industry to maintain as good hygiene and health standards as possible. And you can even see it here today in Buzzwells in terms of the social distancing, in terms of the hand sanitizers, in terms of the interaction with staff. So we've got to make sure we adopt best practices wherever possible. We have to hope that we avoid a global depression, because if you like, tourism is a discretionary activity. We all know that in terms of, you know, we don't go on holiday, or we don't take the short break if money is tight. If there's a global depression in our key source markets, there's going to be a huge impact on international travel and tourism, and unfortunately Ireland will suffer in that regard. So let's hope for a recession and not a depression. And the fourth one, I'm just going to go through the yellow boxes there, is a recovery in aviation. We're an island nation, and this is very self-explanatory, but about 87% of international tourists come to Ireland by air. If you go out to Dublin Airport at the moment, it's like a ghost town compared to what it should be on June 29th. So we have to hope that there's a recovery in aviation, and we need to support aviation and air routes into the country. And we're lucky to a certain extent that in Ireland the two big carriers are Aer Lingus and Ryanair. About 80% of traffic in 2019 came through both those airlines. They both have good balance sheets. Ryanair is obviously cash rich, and Aer Lingus is now part of IAG. They should survive this crisis and come out the other side, but undoubtedly aviation will be in trouble. Even Aer Lingus and Ryanair will have diminished routes, and lots of sort of the marginal carriers, the Norwegians, the Flybees and stuff, are already in an awful lot of trouble, as we know. We as an industry, there's a massive onus on us to continue to exceed expectations of the consumer. So we've got to make sure that if an international tourist comes to Ireland, we match and exceed their expectation and offer good value for money. Brexit is in there. There was a draft of this a couple of weeks ago, and I had soft Brexit or something like that, and that's nearly out the window now in terms of what we can hope for. But we have to hope for a negotiated Brexit, because if there's a cliff edge, if there's a no-deal Brexit, there's going to be an awful lot of consequences and implications for the Irish tourism sector, not just in terms of sterling's depreciation, or not just in terms of the movement of British people into the country, but we'll have possibly the UK on our doorstep, competing for American business against us. And if they're allowed to do things and implement state aid rules that we're tied into, it puts us at a competitive disadvantage. So we've got to really hope for a negotiated Brexit, and we kind of salute the work that the previous government and obviously the incoming government are doing in that regard. A competitive Ireland, it goes without saying, if we lose competitiveness, then we're in trouble. We've got to offer really good value for money. The VAT rate comes into the debate here. We've long argued that the VAT rate in Ireland, which is at 13.5%, needs to go right down to European levels, and today we're saying that it should be put at 5%, which is comparable to what agriculture has as a VAT rate, and that will put Ireland on a competitive footing with the rest of Europe, and it's critically important in terms of a tool to create and stimulate demand. And the last one there is just a tourism industry still standing, and I've referred to it already, but there are 20,000 tourism and hospitality businesses throughout Ireland at the moment. It's Ireland's biggest regional employer. I've said that before, but I'll be saying it another 10 times. If we lose a lot of those businesses as a result of COVID-19, then even if demand recovers in 2021 or 2022, we don't have the product here that we need to entice visitors to the country. So it's vital that the tourism industry still stands, and it's vital that there's a suite of supports to support them. We came to, we did a lot of work on modelling and seeing what Irish tourism could look like in 2025. We worked, I should say, with an external consultant, tourism and travel consult, to help us with this. We worked very closely with the airlines, with ITIC members. We talked to Niall and the Tourism Ireland team, Paul Kelly and the Fortune Ireland team. We looked at a lot of international models to try and come up with a sort of a methodology and a model for looking out to 2025, which is a very difficult thing to do. Very quickly we said, right, we're not going to call it a forecast, because that's next to impossible, but it's, if you like, scenarios. And we came up with three. You'll see them there: the optimistic scenario, the blue baseline scenario, or what we could also call new normal, and then the orange pessimistic scenario. So the optimistic scenario is obviously the one that we hope comes into effect. We as an industry think we can deliver it if the government gives us the right enabling policies and factors and investment strategies. But that is really based on COVID being controlled, and if not a vaccination, certainly treatment, and the sort of the rampaging effects of COVID over the last few months. It becomes a nightmare that's in the past, and instead it's under control and in check. But even with an optimistic scenario, we as an industry are not going to return to 2019 revenue numbers until around 2023, 2024. So let's think about that. You're going to have 3 or 4 years, even at the most optimistic scenario, where the tourism economy will be far less than it was last year. So there's going to be no quick bounce back from this. If there's a pessimistic scenario, and for example COVID doesn't go away, there's a second wave, there's another close down of the tourism economy, obviously the recovery is going to be much, much slower, and there'll be a hell of a lot more job losses. And by the way, a hell of a lot more negative impact on the Irish economy. The blue one is the baseline scenario, or the new normal, which is you know, how things might progress if COVID being kept under check. But I suppose behind all those scenarios is the recommendations within this strategy that I'm going to briefly run through with you, and you'll get them all in your inbox very, very shortly. There's 45 specific recommendations. You'll be pleased to hear I'm not going to go through them all in great detail, but I'll pick out one or two. But our view is, if COVID is under check and the recommendations within the strategy are put in place, we as an industry can deliver the green numbers. And if the government of the day sort of only has a half interest in tourism and doesn't really give the sector the support that it needs, it's going to either be blue or more likely orange. So that is what we're talking about. That's in terms of jobs, in terms of exchequer returns, we're talking about something as significant as that. Again, this will be in your inbox very shortly, or it'll be there at the moment, so maybe no need to look at it too closely, but I'll try and point that out here. The 2019 figure here is international tourism, what international tourism was worth to Ireland in 2019. So you can see there it was €5 billion or 5.1 billion euro in 2019. We estimate that in 2020 that's going to fall to €1 billion. This is international business, so the domestic market isn't in there, but it's going to fall to about €1 billion in 2020, and that's largely because we had January and February in the bag before the COVID crisis hit. And Q4 we expect there'll be a little bit of visiting friends and relatives, there'll be a few holiday makers hopefully from certain markets, but it's absolutely wiped out this year, as you can imagine. We've then looked forward and we've come up with 3 different scenarios, and hopefully it's self-explanatory, but as I say, it's in the report and I'll happily take questions afterwards. Green is the optimistic scenario, blue is the baseline recovery, and orange is the pessimistic recovery. So green, as I mentioned, is if COVID is under check and if the government adopts this policy and puts the various recommendations in place to allow us as an industry prosper and thrive. Blue is if COVID is kept under check, albeit with a few setbacks, but the government doesn't truly adopt this strategy and doesn't truly pursue pro-tourism policies, and it's only kind of half-hearted commitment and interest in tourism and hospitality. And orange is if there's a second wave, effectively, of COVID, and the industry has to shut down again, and there's another closure in international arrivals. Obviously 2020 and 2021 will be desperate, and then the recovery will be very slow. But you can see the difference between optimistic and pessimistic, if you fast forward to 2025, is quite significant. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that, you know, that is only the 2025 differential. But if you aggregate the differential over the 4 or 5 years, you're talking about an over €9 billion difference between the optimistic scenario and the pessimistic scenario. We as an industry think and are confident we can deliver the optimistic scenario if COVID is kept under check and if the government adopts pro-tourism enabling policies. Again, a lot of numbers on the screen, so I'm not expecting everyone to take it all in, but it'll be in your inbox. But there is a methodology behind this. We haven't just magic numbers up. There's an awful lot of sort of surveys with industry members. We talked to the OECD, we talked to the European Commission, we looked at other models. So there's a methodology behind this. But 2019, this includes domestic. 2019, the total value of overseas revenue was €5 billion, the domestic revenue was €2 billion, that gave total revenue of €7 billion. I've excluded fares from this regard, but I can understand that things are getting a bit statty here. Exchequer receipts were €1.63 billion, and jobs were 265,000. That's about 1 in every 10 jobs in the country was tourism and hospitality. So that was 2019. If you fast forward to 2025, the model and the methodology that we did came up obviously with the 3 scenarios: optimistic, baseline and pessimistic. We as an industry, as I keep stating, think we can deliver the optimistic if things go in our favour, if the public health measures are controlled and sensible, and if the government adopts pro-tourism policies. We think we can deliver the optimistic side of the house, which means that we would get revenue here, you can see here, €8.66 billion versus the €7.1 billion last year, and crucially jobs at 323,000 compared to the 265 last year. Now, what you can't see there, but I can obviously send it to you, is the 2021 to 2025 period. So we're obviously, that's 2025, so there's going to be a kind of a climb up to that. And it's really only about 2023, 2024 that on the optimistic scenario, we as an industry and as a sector can get back to 2019 levels. Baseline is slightly less, and then pessimistic, that's if there's a second wave, that's if the government is blind to the needs of tourism and doesn't adopt the pro-tourism recommendations that are in this policy. You can see that even in 2025, jobs 236 versus the 265. So even in 2025, 5 years after this crisis, jobs and revenues to the exchequer will be far less than last year if the pessimistic scenario comes into effect. So I think we all have to hope. We as an industry obviously have a sort of a vested interest in this regard, because we obviously want businesses to prosper and we want employment to rise again. But we've got to hope that we hit those optimistic numbers. We think we can, given a fair wind, given COVID under control, and given crucially the right policies and right tools by the government. Baseline will be where we'll end up if the government doesn't adopt all the recommendations in this strategy, but only adopt some of them. And pessimistic is, unfortunately, if COVID comes back in a second wave, and again if the government is blind to the needs. But you can see over here, and I'm just going to the next because I've identified it here, over a 5-year period, the difference between optimistic and pessimistic is up here. So the difference between optimistic and pessimistic over a 5-year period would be 9.5 billion euro to the economy, and that would equate to over 2 billion euro in tax receipts, and then slightly less obviously for the optimistic versus baseline. I'm conscious that there's a lot of numbers in there. I'm not going to sort of go into too much detail, but there was a very robust methodology put in place by our consultant looking at international practices, surveying closely with industry members, talking to Niall and his Tourism Ireland team, talking to Forge Ireland, talking to airlines. And what effectively we're saying is that tourism can recover, given a fair wind and having the right enabling policies by government. But if the government does not treat tourism as the economic sector it is, and instead doesn't adopt the pro-tourism policies that we've outlined in this recommendation, the climb back and the recovery for Irish tourism will be long and steep, and there'll be an awful lot of businesses that'll get sucked under, and an awful lot of jobs that will get lost, which will be massively impactful, particularly to regional Ireland. I mean, anyone who knows me knows that, my mantra about Ireland's largest indigenous industry and biggest regional employer, but if you go to somewhere like Killarney, 1 in 5 jobs, same in Donegal, it's a massive employer, and to that regard needs an awful lot of attention. I'm conscious that these are small writings, so I'm not going to labour them. It's all literally in your inbox at the moment. What we did was we came up with 6, if you like, chapters or themes within the strategy, and each of those has a number of recommendations. So the first theme was stimulating demand. So obviously that is trying to get business back on the books of Irish tourism and hospitality businesses. I'll just pick out a couple of them. Domestic marketing is going to be particularly important. We've argued, people will have heard this before, of the need for a staycation voucher. Let's stimulate the domestic market. Let's get Irish people and Irish families out there, and particularly over the kind of autumn-winter months, there might need to be an incentive and a stimulus in that regard. We're calling for an additional public holiday at the end of September. Let's try and lengthen the domestic tourism season, and also let's review school holidays. It seems silly to my mind that we don't adopt a German or a French model where the school holidays are staggered over a couple of weeks, and why instead are we cramming everything into the same weeks? If nothing else, it pushes prices up because obviously demand is there, and so let's spread it, and it might lengthen the season. Business tourism is critically important. Let's get international visitors going. So we're calling for a doubling of overseas marketing budget. I think when this crisis ends and COVID is contained or eliminated, international tourism agencies are going to be desperately competing for business, and they're going to be spending money hand over fist. And the danger is Ireland is competing in that regard, or else we won't get the upturn we hope for. And I won't necessarily labour that because there's too much here. And I'm conscious also that writing is small. In terms of the second theme, which is re-establishing Ireland's connectivity, and that's, I suppose, with a bias towards air, because 85%, 87% of tourism arrivals into the country is air. We think the quarantine rule needs to be ended. Other European countries are relaxing theirs, whereas Ireland seems to be doubling down. Effectively, there's a close sign above Ireland at the moment for international arrivals. And remember, that's not just tourism, but it affects exports, it affects FDI, lots of things. So we really think that public health measures can be supported and maintained in terms of testing, in terms of tracing and stuff. rather than the blunt instrument that is a quarantine rule. So that should be ended. And there needs to be an access development fund to get routes back up and running. Airlines will have been hammered. We need to support them getting routes back up and running. And that's not just a tourism thing. That's an FDI thing. That's a Board BIA thing. That's an Enterprise Ireland thing. There needs to be relaxation of state aid flexibility. A lot of other European countries are investing heavily in their airports, in their airlines and stuff. We in Ireland, we can't be the best boy or the best girl in the class. We actually have to be as creative as possible on state aid. Otherwise, we lose ground. Let's support Dublin as a hub airport. We don't want, obviously, the airport departure tax to come back into play. That's suspended at the moment. We hope the government continue to suspend that. But equally, this is the wrong time for an aviation tax. And I think that's something that, we should be unashamed to say that aviation is fundamental to the success of Irish tourism. We have got to restore air routes and air connectivity into Dublin and into the regional airports. And if there's an additional tax imposed on that particular product or that particular service, it's going to depress demand, and airlines could well put their aircraft elsewhere. Now is not the time for that. I'm conscious that European directives and stuff, it's coming down the road, but certainly for the next few years we should not impose an aviation tax, and instead we should be creating as positive an environment as possible for airlines and air routes. The common travel area is fundamental. For example, without getting into technicalities, there's now a quarantine period on British visitors coming into the country, but the British government doesn't impose a quarantine period on Irish people going to Britain. So, the whole common travel area is being undermined at the moment, and I think that's something that we have to be very careful of, particularly with this Brexit stuff reaching an end game. I'm conscious I'm flying through this, and I'm conscious also that the writing is very small, but you have to take my word for it, but as I say, it's in your inbox. In terms of competitive, we're arguing for a 5% tourism VAT rate. That'll put us on an even keel with our European neighbours. The move to 13.5% in budget 2019 was, to our mind, a mistake. It's put Ireland on a massively uncompetitive footing, and that needs to be corrected. And we urge it to be corrected without delay. There's a lot of uncompetitive VAT anomalies there that need to be fixed. I'm just kind of flying through these: insurance reform, reducing cost of credit, Ireland being a world leader in digital capabilities. A lot of this is sort of self-explanatory, but too often sort of, just benign sort of interpretation is given to them by governments of the day. And in fact, we think now is the time. In every crisis, there's an opportunity. Now is the time to double down and actually bring some of these into effect. That just shows you where the Irish tourism VAT rate is vis-a-vis our European neighbours. So you can see we're way over there on the right. We're the highest VAT rate across the whole of the Eurozone, which puts Ireland obviously at an immediate uncompetitive footing. The last two, so you'd be pleased to hear, labour force and workforce is absolutely fundamental to the success of tourism. We are a people business, remember that. We're arguing for a halving of employer PRSI. That came into effect before in 2011. If you remember, the Enda Kenny government came out with a job stimulus package, and they looked at tourism and hospitality and said, right, you are a big employer, you are one, you have a regional bias around the country, and let's have employers PRSI to stimulate new recruits and to stimulate employment in the sector, and we're arguing that needs to be brought back into effect. We think Fortune's role needs to be enhanced and developed. And if you recall, we called for the 1.5 billion euro in terms of grants and liquidity. We think that needs to be channeled through Fortune Ireland. So, to a certain extent, in recent years, there's been kind of, oh, well, we've given money to Enterprise Ireland, that's the SME sector sorted. But that money does not find itself in the books of tourism and hospitality businesses. And instead, Fortune Ireland, the National Tourism Development Authority, should be the one tasked with, if you like, getting that additional money and dispensing it to viable and vulnerable tourism and hospitality businesses around the country. So let's beef up that Fortune Ireland role and really get them as an enterprise development agency. And careers are obviously particularly important. Tourism Day, some of you may recall, we were about to launch in April. COVID put an end to that, so let's kick that off again, because it's a good way of shining a positive spotlight on tourism. The penultimate chapter, you'd be pleased to hear, is funding. At the moment, tourism, you might not be able to make this number out, gets 186 million euro from the Exchequer. That's primarily the money for Fortune Ireland and Tourism Ireland. Obviously, that's insignificant in terms of the challenge that we're now facing. It needs to be, in our mind, go up to about €300 million. But remember, we're calling for the liquidity and the grant supports to be on top of that. So that €300 million should include a doubling of overseas marketing to allow Niall and his team go out there and aggressively compete for Ireland. I'll just run through some of this. The National Capital Plan, there's a 10-year capital plan for obviously every sector in the country. Tourism has one. We think the capital budget for tourism needs to be front-loaded. Let's create new product and new experiences of scale now so that we can stimulate demand. There needs to be support for private sector investment. There's a pot of EU money there. People probably know there's €750 billion there from the EU for COVID, fighting against COVID and getting economies back into some sort of health. Ireland seemingly has allocated about €1.9 billion, or I heard €3 billion the other day. It seems insignificant, but the main thing is that the tourism and hospitality sector gets its fair share of that, because as I hope I've shown you, the tourism and hospitality sector has been hit in the solar plexus by this crisis, and we need all the support we can get. And the last one is ensuring concerted government focus. So we called for a dedicated department. We printed this on Friday. We got other news on Saturday. We're very disappointed, by the way, and I'm not, I haven't been shy about saying this, but we're very disappointed where tourism has ended up in the new government. It's not in an economic portfolio. It's not in a business portfolio. And hopefully, as I've conveyed to you, this is a business and economic department, or economic sector of the economy, and requires a business and economic ministry. So we're very disappointed where we've ended up. There seems to be an awful lot of stuff in that particular sector. We wish Catherine Martin well. We'll work very closely with her. We'll obviously be putting this on her desk today and trying to get her to adopt as much of it as possible. If nothing else, we think tourism should be the first name in that ministry. It should be known as the Department of Tourism, and then media and Gaeltacht and all the rest. At the moment, we're sort of buried in there among other things. That's simply not good enough, and we should be in an economic portfolio to our mind, and we'll still be shouting that. Let's maximise state assets. We've got to make sure we're green and clean as much as possible, and the industry is doing huge efforts in that regard. There's lots of stuff there, but effectively a whole of government approach. And that was the kind of frustration I think we got on Saturday, is that tourism was mentioned nearly as an aside by the new Taoiseach. And it was kind of thrown in with, a licorice all sorts of departments. And tourism is just too important for the health of Ireland's economy. And it's Ireland's biggest regional employer by far. The example I always use, because it was topical last summer, was Centre Parks. Who else could go to Longford and create 1,000 permanent jobs? They brought natural gas to Longford. That's an example of a tourism and hospitality business providing long-term, sustainable economic stimulus in regional Ireland. Places for indirect investment and multinationals won't go. Tourism can deliver, but only given the right enabling policies. And COVID has absolutely blown to smithereens the tourism and hospitality sector in the country. There's a huge ascent that we all have to climb to get back towards some sort of sustainability, or get as close as we can to the peak, and hopefully prosper again into the future. But to do that, we as an industry will deliver, absolutely, because we've shown we can deliver from setbacks in the past, the 9/11s, the ash clouds, the foot and mouth. We've always bounced back. But this is a bigger crisis than we've ever known. And to a certain extent, I think Morris might have said, it's an existential crisis. Will we have a tourism and hospitality industry in 2021, 2022? And if we don't, by the way, that makes Niall's job overseas, I'm putting a Niall in the back of the room, his job overseas is promoting and selling Ireland, but that's based on the quality of the product. So if we've lost a lot of businesses, if we've lost a lot of people as a result of COVID, we will have a Herculean task to get out of this. We are confident that we can do it. We bounced back before from crises. We're confident we can do it, but we have to get a fair wind. We have to hopefully get a benign sort of external environment, but crucially, the things we can control in terms of government and in terms of regulation have got to go in our way, and that's the big sort of message we have from today.